For 11 separate interviews, Stephen Miller repeated the same line. Never happened. Not once. Until a congressional hearing turned into something else entirely, when Ted Lieu pressed play on a piece of government video that wasn't supposed to exist. And in that moment, the silence inside the room began to contradict everything he had ever said. This is not a normal hearing. This is a controlled demolition of a public statement, executed in real time, with the witness still sitting under oath as his own past words begin to testify against him. And the question is no longer what was said, but what was deliberately constructed to never be said out loud. House Judiciary Committee Room. 254, Wednesday, 2:34 p.m. Eastern. The setting looked routine. Rows of lawmakers, legal staff, journalists adjusting lenses, the low murmur of procedural oversight. Stephen Miller sat composed, posture straight, notes aligned in front of him, the confidence of someone who had rehearsed every possible question, every predictable line of attack. For the first hour, nothing broke that rhythm. Budget allocations, enforcement priorities, procedural clarifications. He answered all of them with the same measured cadence, the same practiced control. But control only works when you know the boundaries of the room. At exactly 3:41 p.m., Ted Lieu leaned forward and asked a question that sounded almost administrative. February 9th. Fox News. Did you make a statement about border statistics? Miller nodded, calm, almost dismissive. Yes, many appearances. Nothing unusual. But this wasn't about memory. It was about precision. Because Lieu wasn't asking what Miller remembered. He was preparing to show what Miller had already committed to record. The transcript appeared on screen. Clean. Verbatim. The question from the host. The answer from Miller. I have never instructed anyone to alter border statistics. Not once. Not ever. A categorical denial. Absolute. Unqualified. Repeated enough times to become a shield. And under oath, sitting in that room, Miller did not retreat from it. He doubled down. That statement is accurate. That was the moment the hearing stopped being procedural. Because what happened next was not a follow-up question. It was a transition into prosecutorial mode. Lieu closed the laptop slowly, not rushed, not dramatic, controlled. Then this should be very easy to explain. 5 words, but they carried something heavier than accusation. They carried certainty. He reached for a small remote, nodded once, and the screen behind him flickered to life. And this is where everything shifts. Because what appeared was not a news clip, not commentary, not interpretation. It was internal government footage, time-stamped, high resolution, recorded days before that Fox News interview ever aired. The room didn't react immediately. Not yet. Because it takes a second for recognition to register, for faces to align, for voices to match. And then they heard it. Miller's voice. Clear, undistorted, not under oath, not in front of cameras, but in a room where he believed the audience was controlled. We need to adjust the methodology. Not falsify, adjust, not change the numbers, frame them differently. A distinction that sounds technical until you realize what it actually does. Lieu didn't interrupt the video right away. He let it play, long enough for the phrasing to settle, long enough for the contrast to build between what was said on television and what was being revealed now. Then he froze the frame. 15 feet tall on the screen behind him, Miller's own face, mid-sentence, and turned back to the witness table. Mr. Miller, which statement is true? That question didn't just hang in the air. It fractured the entire premise of the hearing. Because now, this is no longer about policy. It's about whether a statement repeated 11 times across national media can survive contact with a single piece of verified evidence. The room didn't just react to the video, it recalibrated around it. Because once Stephen Miller's own voice entered the record, the hearing stopped being about what he could explain and started being about what he could no longer deny. And in a congressional setting, that shift is everything. Words are flexible. Video is not. Ted Lieu didn't rush to speak. He let the final sentence from the clip hang. It is still accurate. It is just framed better. That phrase wasn't loud, but it carried intent. Because it tells you something critical, the goal was never to change reality outright. The goal was to control how reality is presented to oversight. Now pause there, because that is the first fracture point. On February 3rd, inside a DHS conference room, Miller is on record discussing an alternative calculation method, instructing staff to separate certain encounter data into an internal database, explicitly not for congressional testimony. That is not speculation. That is not interpretation. That is a directive, recorded, time-stamped, preserved across 3 devices with matching metadata. 6 days later, February 9th, on national television, he says the opposite. Not a softer version, not a qualified statement, a categorical denial. Never happened, not once, not ever. Lieu leaned forward, voice steady, almost clinical. Let's not blur this with language, Mr. Miller. You didn't say, "We adjusted presentation." You said, "It never happened." Those are not the same sentence. That's not rhetoric. That's alignment. And alignment is where contradictions become measurable. Because once those 2 statements are placed side by side, the gap between them is no longer semantic. It's factual. Either the February 3rd meeting reflects reality, or the February 9th statement does. Both cannot occupy the same space. Miller attempted to move into terminology. Congressman, discussing methodology does not constitute altering statistics. Agencies routinely. Lieu cut in, not loudly, but precisely. Then explain the separation. He turned back to the screen and replayed a narrower segment. Not the full clip, just the operational core. Separate database, internal use only, not for congressional testimony. 3 phrases. That's all it took. Because those 3 phrases introduce something Miller's public statements never acknowledged. Exclusion. Not deletion. Exclusion. Data that exists, but is intentionally routed away from the body responsible for oversight. Now the question sharpens. If the data is complete, why is Congress not seeing all of it? If the methodology is standard, why does it require internal-only categorization? This is where what was said starts collapsing under what was not said. Miller never told the public there was a secondary data set. He never disclosed that certain encounters would be reclassified under an alternative framework. He never mentioned that part of the data would be withheld from congressional testimony. That silence is not accidental. It is structural. Lieu didn't need to accuse. He just stacked. February 3rd, you introduce an alternative calculation. February 9th, you deny any alteration. Between those dates, you do not disclose the existence of a separate database. He paused. That is not clarification. That is omission. And omission, in this context, is not neutral. Because when you are under oath, and when you are speaking to the public in an official capacity, what you choose not to say becomes part of the record just as much as what you do. Miller's posture tightened. His hands, flat on the table earlier, now pressed slightly inward, as if anchoring against the weight of the exchange. Congressman, you are presenting this as concealment. It is not. It is standard policy discretion. And there it is. Policy discretion. A phrase that sounds administrative enough to deflect until you measure it against outcome. Lieu didn't challenge the phrase. He challenged its boundary. Policy discretion does not extend to deciding what Congress is allowed to see. No raised voice, no theatrical pause, just a line drawn. Because once you accept that a government official can decide which data reaches oversight and which data does not, you are no longer talking about methodology. You're talking about control. And once it becomes about control, the language starts to matter less than the sequence. Because control is not declared. It's revealed through behavior over time. And that's exactly what Ted Lieu does next. He doesn't introduce a new claim. He reconstructs a timeline that Stephen Miller himself created, step by step, until the pattern stops looking accidental. Let's continue, Lieu says, voice still measured, still contained. He turns back to the screen. A new file appears. Same room, same table, same faces. Different date. March 8th. Now pay attention to the shift. Because February 3rd was about instruction. What to do with the data. March 8th is about defense. What to say if someone finds out. A staffer's voice comes first, hesitant, careful with wording. If this comes up in a congressional inquiry, how should we characterize the alternative calculation? That question alone changes everything. Because it proves awareness. Awareness that what was discussed might not survive exposure. And then, on screen, Miller answers. No pause, no hesitation. We never had that conversation. Not, we explained it differently. Not, we clarified methodology. We never had that conversation. Lieu freezes the frame. He lets the words sit, not because they are loud, but because they are definitive. And in a room governed by oath, definitive statements are dangerous when evidence exists. March 8th, Lieu continues, you are instructing staff on how to respond if Congress asks about the February 3rd meeting. He doesn't look at Miller yet. He lets the sequence speak first. February 3rd, you issue the directive. February 9th, you deny it publicly. March 8th, you instruct others to deny it if questioned. Now he turns. That is not confusion, Mr. Miller. That is coordination. And this is where the hearing crosses a threshold. Because contradiction can be explained. Miscommunication can be defended. But coordination, especially when it involves multiple people being told to repeat the same denial, that introduces intent. Miller leans forward again, but this time the structure of his response is different. Less fluid, more defensive. Congressman, that interpretation is incorrect. I was advising staff on how to communicate complex policy discussions in a simplified way to avoid misrepresentation. Simplified. Avoid misrepresentation. Two phrases that attempt to reposition the directive as clarification rather than concealment. But here's the problem. Lieu doesn't attack the explanation. He isolates the contradiction inside it. Then why does simplification require denying that the meeting occurred? No raised voice. No interruption. Just a question that collapses the framing. Because simplification reduces detail. It does not erase events. And we never had that conversation is not simplification. It is negation. Lieu steps closer, not physically, but in logic. You didn't instruct them to explain the methodology differently. You instructed them to deny the existence of the discussion entirely. He pauses. That is not communication strategy. That is narrative control. The room is quiet again, but it's a different kind of quiet now. Not confusion. Recognition. Because everyone in that room understands what just happened. not in terms of politics, but in terms of structure. A directive was given. A denial was issued. And then a secondary directive was issued to maintain that denial across future scrutiny. That's not a single moment. That's a system maintaining itself. And once a system like that is visible, the question shifts again. Not what did he mean, but what was he trying to prevent from being seen? And once the question becomes what was being prevented from being seen, the hearing stops being about explanation and becomes about consequence. Because there's a difference between defending a statement and defending a sequence, and Stephen Miller is no longer dealing with one sentence on television. He's dealing with a chain of actions that now sit on record, ordered, dated, and impossible to separate without breaking the logic that holds them together. Ted Lieu doesn't escalate emotionally. He escalates structurally. "Mr. Miller, let's be precise," he says, voice still controlled, still operating inside procedure. "You created a method that separated data from what Congress would receive. You denied that action publicly. And when internal concern was raised, you instructed staff to deny the existence of that action if questioned." He pauses, not for effect, but to let the structure lock. That is not a misunderstanding. That is a closed loop. A closed loop. That phrase lands differently because it implies completion. Not a mistake that drifted off course, but a system that feeds itself. Instruction, denial, reinforcement. Once you define it that way, every piece of evidence stops looking isolated and starts looking engineered. Miller's attorney shifts, preparing to intervene, but Lieu moves faster, not louder, just ahead. "And here's what matters," Lieu continues. "Not the label you use for the data, not the terminology you prefer. What matters is that Congress, the body responsible for oversight, was not given the full picture of what existed inside your department." He leans slightly forward. And that was not an accident. This is the moment the hearing transitions into moral ground. Because up to now, everything has been technical. Methods, categories, statements, timelines. But the impact of those decisions doesn't stay technical. It moves outward. Think about what that separation actually means. Two sets of numbers. One visible, one internal, one presented as complete, one withheld from testimony. That's not just data management. That's reality management. And once reality is managed differently, depending on who is asking, the entire premise of oversight begins to fracture. Because oversight only works if the information being overseen is whole, not curated, not filtered. Whole. Lieu doesn't need to raise his voice to make that point. "Mr. Miller, when the American people hear border statistics reported to Congress, they assume those numbers reflect the full scope of what your agency has recorded." He pauses. Do they? No interruption. No rescue. Because that question doesn't just sit in the room. It extends beyond it. It lands on every report, every briefing, every number that has ever been presented as complete. Miller doesn't answer immediately. And again, the silence speaks. Not as hesitation, but as absence. Absence of a clean defense that can reconcile all 3 points at once: the directive, the denial, and the instruction to deny again. Lieu straightens. And this is where procedure returns. But now it carries weight. "Mr. Chairman, based on the evidence entered into the record, including verified video, corroborated metadata, and repeated public statements, I move that this matter be referred for further investigation." No accusation in tone. But the implication is unmistakable. Because once something moves beyond the room, it is no longer contained by it. The gavel falls. The motion is seconded. And just like that, the narrative exits the hearing and enters a different system, one where the question is no longer how something was explained, but whether it crosses a legal threshold. And that leaves one final question, not for the committee, but for everyone watching. If a statement can be repeated over and over with absolute certainty, while evidence already exists to contradict it, what does that say about the system that allowed it to stand unchallenged for that long? And more importantly, how many other complete versions of reality are actually partial by design? If you believe accountability should not depend on what is chosen to be shown, hit like. If you think this kind of breakdown needs to reach further than this room, share it. And if you want to keep seeing what happens when statements meet evidence in real time, subscribe and stay close. Because this wasn't just a hearing. It was a test of whether the truth survives